Hello everyone and welcome to Your Library at Home. My name is Sam Hagan. I'm part of the library's public programming team. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we meet on country. I live and work on Gadigal land, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present and especially emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us today. Welcome to the latest in our series of online curator talks. Today we're going to hear from my colleague Ronald Briggs. Ronald is a Gamilaroi man, originally from Moree in central northwestern New South Wales. He originally trained as a school teacher, but luckily for us, he came to the library many years ago where he worked as a librarian, but he's since become a curator. He's worked on numerous of the library's exhibitions and displays. But today, Ronald will be talking about the tabloid-style magazine Pix, which began circulation in Australia in January 1938. And it was actually one of Australia's most popular weeklies at that time. It was distinctly Australian content and occasionally featured stories relating to Indigenous people, bringing attention to conditions on reserves in New South Wales. So in 2008, the ACP Photo Archive, including the negatives for Pix magazine, were donated to the library and have recently been digitised. So Ronald is today going to share some of the stories behind the people, places and events recorded in these images. I'll be back on your screens at the end to facilitate the Q&A, but in the meantime, I'd like to invite Ronald to join me on screen. Ronald, are you there?
Yes, hello Sam, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks, good.
I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining in this afternoon's presentation about the Pix magazine archive that we've got in the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin also by, I'd like to begin also by acknowledging that that the library resides on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to Gadigal people and also to elders past and present and those emerging. I also would like to say hi to any other Aboriginal people out there that have tuned in this afternoon. Just a little cultural advisory before we begin, that the following presentation does contain images of deceased persons, including people who are recently deceased. So that's just to let you know that some of the pictures you might see may be of people that you know who have passed away recently. So let's talk a little bit about Pix itself to begin with. Pix magazine was one of Australia's most popular weekly magazines. If you were born after 1971, then you might not even know that this magazine existed because it stopped being circulated in 1971. It actually didn't stop. It was merged with another magazine called People. And it was very tabloid in nature. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. As you can see with the pictures on the screen, it was a tabloid. It was sensational. It was mostly photo-based, sensational headlines, you know, all about the celebrities, all about the quirky and unusual things that were happening. But I'd like to just point out that it began in January 1938, which was on the 29th. The first edition was the 29th of January 1938, which was just 3 days after Australia Day in 1938. And the most significant thing about that particular date is that it was the 150th anniversary, the sesquicentenary, of the arrival of the first fleet in Australia. So Australia was in a bit of a fervour, a bit of an excitement. There were celebrations all over the country, celebrating 150 years since the white people arrived in 1788. So it was in that sense of nationalism, I guess, and patriotism and you know, glorifying all things Australian, that Pix was established in that atmosphere. And it was a distinctly Australian publication. I mean, it did include lots of, you know, overseas celebrities and stars and world politics and that sort of thing, but it was really Australia focused. It was based in Sydney, so it was mostly New South Wales related. Most of the stories, most of the photographers who worked for Pix did their work in New South Wales specifically. But saying that, there are lots of other states included in the magazine over its lifespan. It began in 1930, as I said, it began in 1938. Now, there are thousands of photo negatives, as Sam mentioned in the introduction, that were donated to the library in 2008 from Pix magazine. So all of those negatives that the photographers and photographs that the photographers were taking for Pix magazine are now with the library. And it's only in the last few years that we've begun to digitize them all, which means that we can put them online so that people can see photographs from the Pix magazine online through the State Library's website and catalogue. The negatives that we have in the library, the photos we have in the library, cover the years from 1937 to 1968. So, and there are more than 30,000 photographs in that collection. So it's taken a while to get them all catalogued and digitised, but thankfully it's all coming to fruition now. And I guess I'd just like to say that what's frustrating for me and for librarians and people who are interested in that sort of thing, in this sort of thing, is that unfortunately a lot of the photographers aren't named. So even though we've got all these wonderful photographs, we don't necessarily know who the photographer was, unfortunately.
Ronald, can I just interrupt you for a sec? Sorry. Sam,
yes.
Tech difficulties. Have you started sharing your screen yet?
Have I?
We can't see your slides.
You can't?
No. Oh, do you want to try? Just have a go.
That's terrible. Let me just go back to the beginning.
Just checking. Share screen.
Sorry.
Zoom. It's all right.
I have share screen and there. Oh, sorry everyone. Sorry everyone. That's me. That's just me not knowing how to do this properly. Sorry.
There we go. All good. I'll leave you to it.
Oh, sorry.
Don't be silly. See you soon.
So I'll go back to where I was at. Sorry about that, everyone. Oh, no, that's awful. So the next screen just gives you an indication of the types of stories, the types of things that Pix covered. There you've got Marilyn Monroe, you've got the tattooed lady, you've got cute little kids, but really it was like I mentioned, it was a photo journal. Really, it was just lots of photos. Sometimes they did serious stories, and we'll have a look at some of those a bit later on. But it was really just for a weekly that people picked up at the checkout, and had to read for the family to read. It wasn't really aimed at kids, I don't think. It was aimed more at at a male audience, a male gaze. But it was just one of those light, sensational, interesting things that people could read. And to be honest, I think that a lot of white Australia, what they would have learned or known about Aboriginal people, they would have probably picked up from Pix, because they wouldn't have necessarily come into contact with Aboriginal people in their daily lives. So a lot of the information they would have known or heard about regarding Aboriginal people in Australia would have been from popular magazines like Pix. I searched through 17 years worth of Pix magazine, and these are the only 6 editions that had an Aboriginal person on the cover. The first one there, the gentleman up there on the top with the spear, that's from 1938, the first year it was published, and the one down the bottom shows the boxer Dave Sands, and that's from and that's from 1950. So between 1938 and 1950, there were 6 covers that featured an Aboriginal person. Usually a cover had a picture of a woman in a swimsuit, or a woman on the beach, or a glamorous picture of a woman, a bit like Women's Day. But so I don't want you to think that Pix magazine regularly covered Aboriginal topics. They didn't. Sometimes you could go for 6 months and you wouldn't even see an article or a story or a picture regarding an Aboriginal person. They did occasionally cover Aboriginal topics. So I don't want you to go away thinking that Pix is, really always had a story about Aboriginal people. It's just occasionally. But when they did, the photographs are absolutely beautiful, as we're going to see. The photographers really knew their work. The stories reflect the attitudes and opinions of the journalists at the time. Language isn't very nice. We wouldn't use those words to describe Aboriginal people today, but it is still an interesting social document as well. Yeah, as you can see, the first one of the gentleman with the spear from the early years of Pix is more of an anthropological approach. Then we get into the period of assimilation, which is where white society was trying to absorb Aboriginal people into their society by making Aboriginal people more like them. It's the whole policy and it just typifies, the mid 20th century, really, Australians' attitudes and government attitudes towards Aboriginal people. And we'll see a bit more of that in a moment. Okay, sorry, we'll get underway. Now, interestingly, this story is from the very first edition of the Pix magazine, which was published on the 29th of January 1938. Now, in that first edition, there is a story about this internationally famous, well-known circus performer, a high wire act. And his name was Colleano. Now, he travelled the world. He was actually born in Lismore in 1899. There's a huge family. He was one of 10 kids. They began, the family actually moved to Lightning Ridge for a little while when they were kids. And while they were in Lightning Ridge, they became interested in acrobatics and performing, the whole family. And they became a troupe, if you like, the Sullivans. And they moved to Sydney, and Con became really interested in circus performing. And the story there you can see of the poster that was used. Con, he travelled the world with various circus groups, South Africa, all of Europe, the United States, even coming back and performing in Sydney occasionally, in Australia occasionally. But he eventually went to live in the United States and became a naturalised American. He actually died there only a few years ago in 1973. But what's interesting is that Con projected to the world, or told the world, that he was of Spanish descent. And that's why he was so exotic looking, if you like. But in actual fact, he was, his father was a white man by the name of Sullivan, but his mother was an Aboriginal woman, part of the Robinson mob clan from up Bundjalung country. And it's hard to know why he didn't identify himself as an Aborigine, but the Aborigines Protection Act of the time was so restrictive that it would have been impossible, or not impossible, but it would have been quite difficult for him to move around the country freely, even to get a passport, move overseas. So I guess to protect to give him some freedom, he identified not as an Aboriginal person, but as someone from another nationality. Now, the story in Pix for that particular edition shows him, practicing in a backyard somewhere, his world famous front somersault, called a foot-to-foot somersault, that he invented, which basically means that he could do a forward somersault, and land in exactly the same place on the wire with his feet in the exact same position. Now, no one had ever been able to do that before, so it was quite a feat, and why he was so well known throughout the world, or throughout the circus world at least. And at the bottom of the screen there, you can see that he's holding a little passbook. And from Pix magazine, we know that little passbook was actually the one given to him by Adolf Hitler. And that allowed him to travel around the whole of Germany freely. Whenever, he was stopped by guards, he could just pull out his little book and say, here, I've got this thing from Hitler saying I can go wherever I like, which is quite amazing. And the second picture shows Con holding a little medal there. And that medal was actually given to him by Benito Mussolini in Italy. And the medal declares him the, what does it call him? Sorry, I had it written down here. He was the king of the wire. So Mussolini gave Con Colleano a medal declaring him the king of the wire. Now, if Mussolini and Hitler had known that Con was an Aboriginal person from the north coast of New South Wales, then he might not have been treated so well, I guess. And using the name Colleano in Italy, I guess that's brought a bit of attention to Mussolini. But who knows? But they're just interesting little tidbits from the Pix that accompany the story about Con Colleano. The articles doesn't mention, of course, that he's an Aboriginal because Con never told anyone he was. But the gist of the article was that he's probably Australia's best paid performer, earning £260 a week. Now, later reports says that he was, when he was travelling around Europe and America, that he was actually earning £1,000 a week. So he became quite wealthy from the work that he was doing. There's a movie in there somewhere. Someone out there has to get, there's a book written called King of the Wire a few years ago. Someone should adapt that and make a movie out of it. It's just a fantastic story and Con is covered in the first edition of Pix. Just something to remember. You never know, you might get a trivia question one day. Now, here's an interesting story that was featured in Pix as well in 1943, November 1943. During World War II, after the Japanese had done some bombing in the Northern Territory around Darwin, there's a little island called Croker Island just off the north coast of Darwin, just off the coast of Darwin, and there was an Aboriginal home there. So these were kids who today we would call members of the stolen generations, but because after the bombing there was a mass evacuation of the island, and these kids were actually sent to a place called the Crusaders Camp, which is at Otford, just down the coast from Sydney, in between Sydney and Wollongong. There's this little coastal place called Otford. And there were 95 kids and their carers who were sent to Otford during the Second World War. And Pix sent a photographer down and did a wonderful documentary series on the kids there and what they were up to during the time here. Again, it's in the assimilation era. Pix is all about assimilation. It's not. There's nothing really about going into in-depth studies of culture and revival of language or anything like that. It's all about assimilation and assimilating Aboriginal people into the larger white society. So their article for this particular story does focus on how well they were adjusting, how well the Aboriginal kids were adjusting to living in a predominantly white society. Croker Island was 99% Aboriginal. So from them to move from there to Otford and go to white schools, live in dormitories, go to the movies, all that sort of things, talking about how well the kids were adjusting to life in New South Wales, and they actually stayed for a few years. They didn't return to Croker Island until 1946, after the war had ended. So they were here for a while. And like I said, it's a mostly propaganda piece saying this is how wonderful. It was actually organised by the Methodist Overseas Mission, and it was really about what a wonderful job the Methodist Overseas Mission was doing. But, given, that's the side story, but in terms of documenting what these kids, and if you go to the actual Pix magazine to read the articles, you get some of the kids' names, you get more information about what other activities they were doing, who was in charge, all of that nice background detail. So, I forgot to mention at the beginning that Pix magazine itself is digitized. We've got all of the negatives and the photographs, not all, but most of the photographs and negatives that were used for Pix, but the magazine itself is also digitized. And if you've heard of Trove from the National Library of Australia, where you can go to read online newspapers, you'll find that Pix, up to 1954 at least, has been digitised, and you can read the articles about these particular photographs through Trove. Now, occasionally, the photographers, because it was all about, you know, Australia and Australian life, the photographers often went out bush. They were covering rural and remote areas, you know, uniquely Australian stories that they wanted to include in their magazine. So, of course, travelling through rural New South Wales particularly, they would often encounter or engage with Aboriginal communities that they would meet along the way. So we've got some wonderful documentary photographic records of what conditions were like for Aboriginal people in New South Wales between about 1938 up to about 1960. And I've just gone through and selected, and like I said earlier, it wasn't every single issue. Sometimes you have to go through, you know, 6 months worth just to find a story. But when they did do a story, the angle was usually, this is how we're helping them. Assimilation is happening. Assimilation is good. And these are some of the things that are happening. But they're just like I said, a wonderful record, a documentary photographic record of what life was like living on an Aboriginal reserve, you know, during the 20th century. So here we have pictures from Bogabilla, and the professional photographer, beautiful photographs that stand on their own. You know, they could easily, you could easily include them in exhibitions or that sort of thing. But like I said, if you go to the magazine and read the article, it'll give you more information about that particular time. Often it'll give you the names of people in pictures as well. So this is a wonderful series that we're taking. There's more. Because as you probably know, when you're shooting a story, you go out, you take as many photos as you can, but they might only choose 2 or 3 of them to put in the actual magazine or the article. So if you go to our website and have a look at the series, you'll see all of the photographs that the photographer took on that day or those particular days that he was there on site. So you get more variety of images apart from what was actually published in the magazine. So here we've got some wonderful pictures of people from Bogabilla, which is central northwestern New South Wales, just north of Moree, of course. And it happens to be where my dad was from, so it's a wonderful. And this is a little bit later, but around the time that my father was born, and these are the conditions that he would have been living in. You see the old man there, very well respected elder from the community. You see the kids there. Bottom left, receiving rations. You've got the little girl sitting on the bed, showing what, you know, what her home life was like. Another beautiful series is taken at Wellington, or the Nanima Reserve, just outside of Wellington in central western New South Wales, Wiradjuri mob. And again, it's just a wonderful collection of images that show what life was like living on an Aboriginal reserve at the time. If you're not aware, an Aboriginal reserve was a little parcel of land that was set aside for Aboriginal people to live on. You know, in the early years when they were first established in around 1870s, 1880s, it was sort of like a voluntary thing. You could move there if you wanted to and live. But over time, it became government policy that Aboriginal people should live on Aboriginal reserves. So most Aboriginal people, Aboriginal families in New South Wales, in their history, will be associated with an Aboriginal reserve, and a lot of Wiradjuri people from around Wellington would have lived, or families would have lived at Nanima at some stage. But like I said, it shows you what conditions were like. I love the picture of the lady with the baby and the little girl behind her. It's probably mum and her kids, but it shows her living in a shack. And if you have a look at the walls behind her, you can see that they're probably made out of those old kerosene tins that were nailed to create structures and stuff. But inside the house, you can't actually see the floor, but it may be a dirt floor. You see, you know, in the middle picture of what the kids, although, you know, Pix is all about happy, smiling kids, so happy smiling kids being assimilated. So there's a wonderful group of kids, and if you go to the actual article, it actually gives you the names of a lot of these people as well. And you've got the nice little picture of there's always, whenever they went to an Aboriginal community, they always had the nice little cute picture of the kid in the bathtub or having a wash, and then you've got the one there who's not too happy, the water might be too cold or something. Anyway, and there's another, like I said, not all of the pictures that you see from the negs that were taken on the day were used in the magazine. So these are just some others that were used for pics. And I know from looking at the article that this was used in, that the little girl there, her name is Claudia Carr. Carr family, prominent family from the Wellington region. And there you've got some happy smiling kids running down the hill, but it shows you how the actual reserve was laid out as well and what the houses look like on the outside. So it's a wonderful record of, as I keep saying, a record of what conditions were like on these reserves. All that. Here's another little story that you may not know about, but in 1948, sorry, not 1948, in 1942, a lot of kids, around 25 children from the Northern Territory, were evacuated to Mulgoa, which is a little suburb near Penrith, out in Western Sydney. So these 25 kids were brought to Mulgoa by the Church Missionary Society, and they set up a mission. Now, this is something that was new to me a few months ago when I discovered it, that there was an actual mission at Mulgoa in Sydney in the 1940s and 50s. So these kids were brought by the church down to live in Sydney, and of course they grew up in Sydney, and many of them remained in Sydney and still live, their families are still living in Sydney today. But this is a wonderful record of the church, of the mission, the Mulgoa Aboriginal settlement from 1948. And if you go to the magazine again, you'll get a little bit of background, but a lot of these are named, people are named. I won't go into it. I'll just suggest if you get a chance to have a look online, because this is an amazing story about an Aboriginal settlement in Sydney of kids and people from the Northern Territory, which is just amazing to read. And as I said, a lot of the families included in this article are still living in Sydney today. Some moved back, of course, and dispersed throughout New South Wales. That really is just a selection of what I think is an amazing resource for researchers, for historians, for family historians, for people interested in Aboriginal studies and Aboriginal history, that our recently digitised collection from the Pix magazine is a great resource for researchers to use. Oh, I forgot I put this one in, sorry. This shows Aboriginal people living out at Lightning Ridge or near Lightning Ridge from November 1948. And again, just a nice series showing, the lifestyle conditions of what would have been like at the time. And as I said earlier, they always have the picture of the happy, smiley kid to show how well assimilation is working. But, so it has that little propaganda function as well. I mean, because to be honest, for a lot of Aboriginal people, a lot of Aboriginal families, times were tough. I mean, this was the, post-war depression era, and Aboriginal people were doing it tough. The Aborigines Protection Act restricted a lot of what they could do, where they could move. Kids were being removed. The stolen generations were happening. But Pix magazine was putting a happy face on that. Keep that in mind. But as I say, it's still a fantastic record for people to use today. So on that note, I will end, and I'll say thank you for listening to me. ramble on for this last half hour or so. And that's my email address if you want to get in touch and find out any more information about this wonderful collection.
Thank you so much, Ronald. I've joined you again. I'm back. Hello, everyone. I've just got a couple of questions for you, Ronald, you might be able to answer in this last couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Someone's asked if there are any pictures of trackers in the Pix collection.
Yes, there are. In fact, I mean, there's the occasional story, but there is one, and it's about a Mr. Williams from Yass. I can't remember his first name, but there's a wonderful story about a tracker named Williams from Yass. I can't remember the date exactly either, but it's just a great record of the work he was doing. He was a fantastic horseman. So if you get a chance to, go to Trove and type in tracker Yass Williams, and you'll get that wonderful article about him. But then you can come to the library's website and see the fantastic series of photographs that were taken of him and portraits.
We always like people to come back to the library's website.
Yes.
It's part of our shtick. I've got one more question for you. Someone asking, and I think I know the answer to this, but do we know who all the individuals are in the photos?
Yes, if you go to the magazine, people are usually named, but not 100% of the time. I'm respectful of people's privacy. That's why I have included names in this particular presentation. But most of the people that photographs that we've just gone through are named. You can find out who they are. Great.
So that's again back to the library website.
Yes.
All right, Ronald. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
A wealth of knowledge. An absolute wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much, Ronald. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for the next Curator Talk.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.